10 workers in a factory can produce 48,000 pins in a single day. Each worker laboring alone might struggle to make even one. This staggering difference isn't just a curiosity about manufacturing efficiency. It's the fundamental insight that explains why some nations become wealthy while others remain poor, why the modern world exploded into unprecedented prosperity after thousands of years of stagnation, and why capitalism became the dominant economic force reshaping human civilization. On March 9th, 1776, the same year American colonists declared their independence from Britain, a Scottish moral philosopher published a book that would prove equally revolutionary. An inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations didn't merely describe how economies function. It created the very discipline of economics as we understand it today, providing the intellectual foundation for free market capitalism, and fundamentally transforming how humanity thinks about wealth, trade, and prosperity. Adam Smith wasn't an economist in the modern sense because that profession didn't yet exist. He was a professor of moral philosophy, attempting to understand the deepest questions about human society. How do people cooperate? What drives human behavior? Why do some societies flourish while others languish in poverty? His answers would shatter conventional wisdom and reveal a previously invisible system of coordination, more powerful than any monarch's command, more efficient than any bureaucrat's central plan. Smith discovered that when individuals pursue their own interests through voluntary exchange in competitive markets, something remarkable happens. An almost magical transformation occurs where individual self-interest serves the common good, where specialization multiplies productivity beyond imagination, and where freedom creates far more wealth than control ever could. This was capitalism emerging not as a political ideology, but as an observed phenomenon of human nature itself. What made the wealth of nations revolutionary wasn't just its radical ideas, but how thoroughly it demolished the economic orthodoxy of its time. For centuries, the prevailing doctrine of mercantilism held that a nation's wealth consisted of gold and silver in its treasury. That trade was a zero-sum game where one country's gain meant another's loss, and that governments must tightly control all economic activity to ensure prosperity. Smith systematically destroyed these assumptions through careful observation, logical reasoning, and a profound understanding of human motivation. He demonstrated that real wealth isn't precious metals sitting idle in vaults, but the annual production of goods and services that improve people's lives. He showed that trade enriches all participants simultaneously, creating wealth rather than merely redistributing it. He revealed that markets, when left substantially free, coordinate economic activity through the price mechanism with an efficiency no central authority could match. The book's impact was immediate and enduring. Published in 2 volumes, it quickly became the manifesto for rising commercial classes across Europe and the newly independent United States, providing intellectual ammunition against feudal restrictions and mercantilist controls that strangled economic development. Smith's work influenced economists from David Ricardo to Karl Marx, shaped the policies of governments for generations, and set the terms of economic debate for the next century and a half. More profoundly, The Wealth of Nations articulated 3 core concepts that would become the pillars of modern capitalism: the transformative power of division of labor and specialization, the coordinating function of the invisible hand of market competition, and the superior wealth-creating capacity of free exchange over government direction. These weren't abstract theories, but observations about how prosperous societies actually function, grounded in examples from pin factories, woolen coat production, and the everyday transactions of butchers, brewers, and bakers. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to explore these revolutionary ideas in depth, understanding not just what Smith said, but why it mattered and how it continues to shape our economic reality. We'll examine how the division of labor transforms human productivity, multiplying output through specialization in ways that seem almost miraculous. We'll unpack the invisible hand metaphor to understand how decentralized decision-making by millions of self-interested individuals produces order, efficiency, and widespread prosperity without any central coordination. We'll investigate the fundamental pillars of capitalism that Smith identified: free markets, private property, voluntary exchange, competition, and the proper but limited role of government. Most importantly, we'll see how these ideas interconnect to form a coherent vision of how prosperity emerges from freedom, how wealth grows through cooperation, and how the pursuit of individual advantage can serve the common good when channeled through the right institutional framework. This is the story of how one Scottish philosopher's observations about human nature and economic behavior gave birth to the modern world. Adam Smith was baptized on June 5, 1723, in the small coastal town of Kirkcaldy, Scotland, a port of about 1,500 souls that traded in coal, salt, and linen with England and Europe. His exact birth date remains unknown. His father, also named Adam Smith, served as comptroller of customs for the town, but died roughly 6 months before his son entered the world, leaving young Adam to be raised entirely by his mother, Margaret Douglas, who came from a landowning family in Fife. She would remain the most important influence in his life until her death in 1788, just 2 years before his own. The bond between mother and son was extraordinarily close. Smith never married, lived with his mother for much of his adult life, and was devastated by her passing. One curious incident marks Smith's childhood, recorded by his biographer John Ray. At age 3, while visiting relatives in the Fife countryside, young Adam was briefly kidnapped by Romani travelers. His uncle quickly organized a pursuit and recovered the boy unharmed. Ray later dryly observed that Smith would have made a poor Romani, given his bookish nature and absent-minded disposition, traits that would define him throughout his life. Smith was notoriously forgetful, sometimes wandering the streets lost in thought, talking to himself, and occasionally appearing in public in his nightgown, having forgotten to dress properly. These eccentricities masked one of the sharpest minds of the 18th century. Smith received his elementary education at the Burgh School in Kirkcaldy, under the tutelage of David Miller, a gifted teacher whom the town council had recruited from the county seat of Coupar. Miller was innovative for his time, rejecting mere rote memorization in favor of methods that brought learning alive and made it exciting for students. The boys, and only boys as girls, were excluded from such education, read classical texts including works by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus and the Roman historian Eutropius, and they learned Latin from an early age. Smith's childhood copy of Eutropius survives in Kirkcaldy Museum, bearing his signature dated May 4th, 1733. Even as a young student, Smith demonstrated exceptional intellectual gifts, excelling at languages and showing the wide-ranging curiosity that would characterize his mature work. At 14 years old, which was not uncommon for the period, Smith entered the University of Glasgow in 1737. This decision would prove transformative. Glasgow was then emerging as one of the intellectual powerhouses of what historians now call the Scottish Enlightenment, an explosion of philosophical, scientific, and literary achievement that made 18th century Scotland one of the most intellectually fertile places on earth. The university was small by modern standards, housing only 12 professors who had recently replaced an older system of regents. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in the quality of its faculty and the vibrancy of its intellectual culture. Students at Glasgow enjoyed unusual freedom to attend lectures across various disciplines, rather than following a rigid curriculum, encouraging the kind of broad intellectual curiosity that Smith possessed in abundance. At Glasgow, Smith encountered the man who would shape his intellectual development more than any other, Francis Hutcheson, the Irish-born professor of moral philosophy, whom Smith later described as the never-to-be-forgotten teacher. Hutcheson was a leading figure in the Scottish Enlightenment and a proponent of moral sense theory, which held that human beings make moral judgments using their sentiments and feelings rather than purely through rational calculation. This was a revolutionary idea that challenged more abstract philosophical approaches. Hutcheson abandoned the practice of lecturing in Latin, making his courses accessible to a broader audience, and he supplemented classical authors with modern thinkers including Hugo Grotius, Samuel Pufendorf, John Locke, and Bernard Mandeville. He was passionately interested in understanding how humans form ideas about right and wrong, how we become moral beings, and what makes a good society. Beyond his intellectual contributions, Hutcheson was renowned as a gifted lecturer who could inspire students by bringing abstract material alive with examples, rhetorical skill, and genuine enthusiasm. Like David Miller at Kirkcaldy, Hutcheson aimed not just to provide solid intellectual grounding, but to shape the character of his students, instilling in them beliefs in liberty, reason, and free speech that would resonate throughout Smith's career. Smith also studied mathematics under Robert Simpson, one of the leading scholars on Euclid, and natural philosophy under Robert Dick, who used the most modern instruments to study Isaac Newton's revolutionary theories. This exposure to cutting-edge science and mathematics, combined with his training in moral philosophy and classical languages, gave Smith an unusually broad intellectual foundation. He was learning to think systematically about everything from geometry to human nature, from natural science to ethics. This interdisciplinary approach, typical of the Scottish Enlightenment, would enable Smith to see connections that others missed, to draw insights from multiple fields, and to construct theories of remarkable scope and sophistication. In 1740, Smith won a Snell Scholarship to Balliol College, Oxford, one of England's most prestigious institutions. The scholarship was designed for Glasgow students intending ordination into the Episcopal Church, and Smith would spend 6 years at Oxford. Unlike his experience at Glasgow, however, Oxford proved deeply disappointing and even hostile to intellectual curiosity. Where Glasgow encouraged students to explore widely and think independently, Oxford enforced a rigid curriculum and outdated methods. The professors were largely indifferent to their students, fulfilling perfunctory duties while collecting comfortable stipends. Smith found the experience stifling and would later write critically of Oxford's educational failures in The Wealth of Nations, contrasting them with the superior Scottish system, where professors' pay depended partly on their ability to attract and retain students, creating incentives for excellence in teaching. On one occasion, Oxford authorities confiscated Smith's copy of David Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature, considering it dangerously skeptical. This episode reveals both the intellectual narrowness of Oxford at the time and Smith's own independent spirit in reading controversial works despite official disapproval. Smith abandoned his exhibition, the financial support from his scholarship, in 1746 and returned to Scotland without taking a degree, which was common at the time since degrees often mattered less than connections and demonstrated ability. For about a year, he lived quietly with his mother in Kirkcaldy, uncertain about his future path. Then opportunity arrived through family connections and the patronage of influential Scots, including Henry Home, Lord Kames, a prominent judge and leading figure in Edinburgh's intellectual life. In 1748, Smith was invited to deliver a series of public lectures in Edinburgh on rhetoric and belles lettres. These lectures proved remarkably successful, attracting middle-class professionals from law, medicine, commerce, and academia, who were eager to improve their minds and engage with new ideas. The lectures brought Smith £100 annually, a comfortable income, and established his reputation as a gifted speaker and original thinker. During this period, common themes in Smith's work began to emerge, including his interest in language, communication, human psychology, and the foundations of social order. Smith's growing reputation led to his election to the chair of logic at the University of Glasgow in 1751, once again with the support of Lord Kames. The following year, when Francis Hutcheson's chair in moral philosophy became vacant, Smith was elected to fill it, the position his beloved teacher had held. This was both a professional triumph and a homecoming to an institution Smith loved. From 1752 to 1764, Smith held the chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow, and by all accounts, these were the happiest years of his life. He threw himself into university life with enthusiasm, serving as quaestor for 6 years, managing finances with characteristic scrupulousness, and later serving as dean of faculty and vice-rector. He was a popular and effective teacher, respected by colleagues and beloved by students. His lectures covered an extraordinarily wide range: rhetoric and belles lettres, natural theology, ethics, and jurisprudence, which encompassed law, government, and economics. Although nothing survives of his lectures on natural theology, except student reports that they dealt with proofs of God's existence and the principles of human mind on which religion is founded, we have extensive student notes from his other courses that reveal the breadth and originality of his thinking. It was during these Glasgow years that Smith deepened his friendships with the remarkable circle of intellectuals that defined the Scottish Enlightenment. Chief among these was David Hume, the philosopher whose skeptical empiricism had shocked Oxford's authorities, but who became one of Smith's closest friends and intellectual companions. Their friendship, which lasted until Hume's death in 1776, was marked by mutual respect, frequent correspondence, and vigorous debate. Both men shared a commitment to understanding human nature through observation rather than abstract speculation, to explaining social phenomena through natural rather than supernatural causes, and to challenging received wisdom wherever it conflicted with evidence and reason. Smith also moved in circles that included Joseph Black, a pioneering chemist who would isolate carbon dioxide and conduct groundbreaking experiments on latent heat, James Watt, who would revolutionize industry with improvements to the steam engine, Robert Foulis, a distinguished printer and founder of Britain's first Academy of Design, and numerous others engaged in science, literature, philosophy, and the arts. Beyond the university, Smith became deeply involved in Glasgow's vibrant club culture, a defining feature of Scottish Enlightenment society. These clubs, found in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and other Scottish cities, served as informal academies where intellectuals, professionals, merchants, and nobles gathered to present papers, debate ideas, and discuss everything from philosophy to agriculture to the latest scientific discoveries. The Select Society in Edinburgh, co-founded by Hume and the artist Alan Ramsay, became the principal forum for discussion of politics, economics, morals, and the arts. The Poker Club, named for its aim to poke up opinion on the militia issue, brought together Ferguson, Hume, Smith, and others for wide-ranging discussions over dinner and claret. Glasgow had its own literary society and political economy club, the latter founded by Andrew Cochrane, a former provost of Glasgow and a successful merchant engaged in colonial trade. From Cochrane and his fellow merchants, Smith acquired detailed first-hand knowledge of trade, business practices, shipping, manufacturing, and commercial finance. This practical information from men actively engaged in economic life would give the wealth of nations its remarkable sense of the real world, grounding Smith's theoretical insights in concrete examples and observable phenomena. Smith could see Glasgow transforming before his eyes during these years. The 1707 Act of Union between Scotland and England had initially disrupted Kirkcaldy's trade, but it opened Scotland to English colonial markets, and Glasgow seized this opportunity with extraordinary energy. The city's population exploded from about 13,000 in 1707 to 77,000 by 1801, and would exceed 200,000 by the mid-19th century. Tobacco from Virginia and Maryland poured through Glasgow's port, making the city wealthy. Shipbuilding, textile manufacturing, and coal mining expanded rapidly. Smith was witnessing the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in real time, observing how commerce transformed not just individual fortunes, but entire societies. He wanted to understand the forces driving these changes, to explain why some nations prospered while others stagnated, to identify the institutions and policies that encouraged wealth creation rather than impeded it. In 1759, Smith published The Theory of Moral Sentiments, his first major work, which examined how human beings make moral judgments and how societies develop ethical norms. The book explored sympathy, the human capacity to imaginatively place ourselves in others' situations, as the foundation of moral reasoning. It argued that we judge our own conduct by imagining how an impartial spectator would view us, internalizing social norms through this process of sympathetic identification. The book was remarkably successful, establishing Smith's reputation far beyond Scotland. It went through 6 editions during his lifetime, with major revisions in later editions reflecting Smith's ongoing refinement of his ideas. The theory of moral sentiments attracted attention across Europe and even caught the eye of wealthy and powerful patrons in England. One such patron was Charles Townshend, an influential politician who would later serve as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Townshend was so impressed by the theory of moral sentiments that he engaged Smith to serve as tutor and traveling companion to his stepson, the young Duke of Buccleuch, one of the wealthiest nobles in Britain. The offer was extraordinary, a generous salary of £300 per year plus expenses during travel, and a pension of £300 annually for life thereafter. This was far more than Smith earned as a professor. Though Smith was conflicted about abandoning his students and colleagues at Glasgow, he recognized both the financial security and the unprecedented opportunity to travel Europe, meet leading thinkers, and observe different economic and political systems firsthand. In early 1764, Smith resigned his professorship, and he and the 17-year-old Duke embarked on a grand tour of the continent that would last until late 1766. They traveled through France and Switzerland, with extended stays in Toulouse, Geneva, and particularly Paris. In Paris, Smith was welcomed into the salons and intellectual circles that defined French Enlightenment culture. He met Voltaire, the famous satirist and philosopher, and formed important connections with the physiocrats, the school of French economists who believed that agriculture was the sole source of wealth and that government should adopt a policy of laissez-faire, letting nature take its course. The leader of the physiocrats was François Quesnay, physician to King Louis XV and author of the Tableau économique, an early attempt to model economic circulation. Smith greatly respected Quesnay's systematic thinking, though he disagreed with the physiocratic focus on agriculture as the exclusive source of value. He also met Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, another physiocrat and later Controller General of Finances under Louis XVI, whose economic ideas deeply influenced Smith's thinking about markets, trade, and economic policy. These encounters exposed Smith to the cutting edge of economic thought and showed him alternative approaches to understanding wealth creation. The grand tour was cut short in October 1766, when the Duke's younger brother, who had joined them in Paris, died suddenly of a fever. Grief-stricken, the Duke and Smith immediately returned to Britain. Despite the tragic ending, the trip had been intellectually invaluable for Smith, exposing him to new ideas, different economic systems, and some of Europe's leading minds. More importantly, the Duke remained deeply grateful to Smith and proved generous beyond the terms of their original agreement. The pension of £300 annually for life gave Smith financial independence. He would never need to work for money again, and this freedom was the gift that made the wealth of nations possible. Smith returned to Scotland in late 1766 and settled back into his mother's house in Kirkcaldy, the town where he had grown up. For the next decade, with one extended stay in London from 1773 to 1776, he devoted himself almost entirely to writing his masterwork. He had been contemplating a book on political economy since at least 1759, when he had promised it in the final paragraph of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. But now he could give it his full attention. Smith was a meticulous, even agonizingly slow writer. He wrote and rewrote, refining arguments, adding examples, seeking precisely the right formulation. His friends and publisher grew impatient, pressuring him to finish, but Smith refused to be rushed. He knew he was creating something unprecedented in scope and ambition. Not merely a treatise on particular economic questions, but a comprehensive system explaining the nature and causes of national wealth. A science of political economy that would analyze how economies function, how they grow or stagnate, what policies promote prosperity, and what institutions create the conditions for human flourishing. The writing was grueling work. Smith's correspondence from this period reveals the mental strain involved. He struggled with structure, with the sheer volume of material, with connecting his theoretical insights to empirical observations, with anticipating and answering objections. By 1773, he felt ready to return to London for final revisions and consultations. London provided access to merchants, bankers, politicians, and government officials who could supply information and feedback. It also allowed Smith to observe firsthand the political debates over the American colonies, which were rapidly moving toward rupture. The British government's mercantilist policies, which Smith planned to critique in his book, were creating the conditions for American independence. Events were lending urgent relevance to Smith's work. Finally, after approximately 9 to 12 years of composition, depending on how one counts, and after 17 years of accumulated notes, earlier studies, and intellectual preparation, Smith completed an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. The book was published on March 9, 1776, in 2 volumes totaling over 900 pages. The timing was remarkable. Just 4 months later, on July 4th, the American colonies would declare independence from Britain, an event partly caused by the very mercantilist policies Smith's book condemned. The first edition of 3,500 copies sold out within 6 months, an extraordinary commercial success for such a substantial and demanding work. David Hume wrote enthusiastically to Smith, "Huge Bell. Dear Mr. Smith, I am much pleased with your performance." The printer, William Strahan, noted that while Edward Gibbon simultaneously published The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, was more immediately popular. The Wealth of Nations sales exceeded expectations for a work requiring serious thought and reflection. This was the context from which The Wealth of Nations emerged. A Scotland transformed by Enlightenment ideas and commercial growth. A Glasgow exploding with trade and industry. A philosophical tradition emphasizing empirical observation and practical application. A network of intellectuals committed to understanding and improving human society. And a brilliant, meticulous mind that had spent decades studying moral philosophy, jurisprudence, and the principles governing economic life. Smith had observed markets, manufacturers, merchants, and laborers firsthand. He had read voraciously in history, philosophy, and the limited economic writings then available. He had taught courses on these subjects for over a decade, refining his ideas through lecture and discussion. He had traveled Europe and witnessed alternative systems, and He had finally found the time, thanks to the Duke of Buccleuch's generosity, to synthesize this vast body of knowledge and observation into a coherent system. The result would revolutionize economic thought and provide the intellectual foundation for modern capitalism. The wealth of nations opens not with grand philosophical statements or historical surveys, but with a factory making pins. This choice was deliberate. Smith wanted to begin with something concrete, observable, and utterly convincing. He wanted to show his readers that the principles governing wealth creation weren't mysterious or theoretical, but visible in the everyday operations of ordinary manufacturers. The pin factory would become the most famous example in all of economic literature, a parable that has been repeated in classrooms for over 2 centuries, and for good reason. It demonstrates with crystal clarity the single most important discovery in The Wealth of Nations, that the division of labor is the primary source of productivity growth, and therefore the foundation of national wealth. Smith begins by asking his readers to imagine a worker attempting to make pins entirely on his own, performing every step of the manufacturing process from start to finish. This hypothetical worker must draw wire from metal, straighten it to remove bends and curves, cut it to the proper length, sharpen one end to a point, flatten and shape the other end to receive the head, create the head itself through multiple operations, attach the head to the body, whiten or polish the finished pin, and finally arrange pins into papers for sale. Each of these steps requires different tools, different skills, different motions. A worker unfamiliar with the process and lacking specialized equipment might struggle all day to produce even a single pin. If extremely industrious and somewhat lucky, he might manage 20 pins, but certainly no more than that. His productivity would be abysmal, his labor almost worthless. This was the reality for most human work throughout history. Individual artisans producing complete items from beginning to end, their output limited by the sheer complexity of doing everything themselves. Now, consider the alternative Smith observed in actual pin factories of his era. The process of making a pin, he noted, could be divided into approximately 18 distinct operations. One worker draws out the wire from coils. Another straightens the wire, removing the curves and bends that accumulate during storage and transport. A third worker cuts the straightened wire into appropriate lengths. A fourth sharpens these cut pieces into points. A fifth grinds the opposite end flat to prepare it for the head. Making the head itself requires 2 or 3 separate operations performed by different workers. Shaping the metal, forming it into the characteristic rounded top, preparing it for attachment. Putting the head onto the pin body is yet another specialized task. Whitening or polishing the completed pins to give them an attractive finish is a distinct operation. Even the final step of arranging finished pins into the papers in which they're sold constitutes its own trade. In some manufactories, Smith observed, all 18 operations were performed by entirely different workers. In smaller operations, individual workers might perform 2 or 3 of these tasks, but the principle remained the same. The work was divided, specialized, separated into discrete steps. Smith claimed to have personally visited a small pin manufactory employing only 10 men. These workers were poor, he noted, and therefore their facility was inadequately equipped with machinery. The tools and equipment were substandard. Yet even under these unfavorable conditions, when these 10 workers exerted themselves, they could collectively produce approximately 12 pounds of pins in a single day. Since a pound contained upward of 4,000 pins of middling size, this meant their daily output exceeded 48,000 pins. Divide that production among 10 workers, and each man could be credited with making 4,800 pins per day. Compare this to the solitary worker who might manage 1 pin, or at most 20. The multiplication of productivity is staggering. Instead of producing 10, or at most 200 pins, among them working separately, 10 workers employing division of labor produced 48,000 pins. This represents an increase in productivity per worker of somewhere between 240-fold and 4,800-fold, depending on how many pins the isolated worker could actually complete. The numbers are so extreme, they strain credibility, and modern historians have indeed questioned Smith's arithmetic and whether the example precisely matches the reality of 18th century pin factories. Some scholars point out that Smith likely never visited an actual pin manufactory, but instead relied on descriptions from Diderot's Encyclopédie, published in 1755, which itself drew on earlier French sources, particularly the engineering studies of Jean-Rodolphe Perronnet, who investigated Norman pin factories in the 1740s. The Encyclopédie's illustrations show exactly 10 men engaged in pin manufacture and describe precisely 18 operations, details that correspond suspiciously well to Smith's account. Historical records from actual French pin factories suggest that the work typically involved 8 or 9 distinct worker roles rather than 18 separate operations, and that the productivity gains, while substantial, were closer to doubling or tripling output rather than increasing it 200-fold. The most time-consuming operation was attaching the heads, requiring 4 or 5 workers, while other steps took almost no time at all. Furthermore, the distinction between operations and workers matters. Describing 18 operations doesn't mean 18 workers each performed a single task. Some operations were sequential steps performed by the same individual. Yet these historical quibbles, while important for understanding the actual development of pin manufacturing, don't undermine Smith's fundamental point. Whether the productivity gain was 20-fold, 50-fold, or 200-fold, the principle remains unchanged. Dividing labor into specialized tasks dramatically multiplies output. Smith himself acknowledged that pin making was a trifling manufacture, deliberately chosen because the entire operation could be observed in a single workshop. He noted that in great manufactures producing goods for mass consumption, the division of labor extended much further than in pin making, involving hundreds or thousands of workers spread across multiple locations, making the full scope of specialization invisible to any single observer. The pin factory was simply a small-scale illustration of a principle that operated throughout the economy with even greater force. The real question isn't whether Smith got every detail right about pin manufacturing, but why division of labor produces such extraordinary gains in productivity. Smith provided 3 fundamental explanations, each addressing a different mechanism by which specialization increases output. These 3 causes work together, reinforcing each other to create the massive productivity multiplies observed in specialized production. Understanding these mechanisms is essential because they explain not just pin factories, but the entire structure of modern economies. The first cause Smith identified is the increase of dexterity in every particular workman. When a worker's entire effort is concentrated on performing one simple operation repeatedly, his skill at that specific task necessarily increases dramatically. Consider Smith's example of a common blacksmith who habitually uses a hammer in his trade. If this smith is called upon to make nails, despite his general facility with metalworking tools, he will struggle. On his first attempt, he might barely produce 200 or 300 nails in a day, and even these will likely be of poor quality. But if making nails becomes his primary business, if he performs this operation daily, his dexterity improves rapidly. With practice, the same smith might easily produce more than 2,000 nails per day, a tenfold increase in output from the same worker performing the same general type of work. The improvement comes entirely from repeated practice, making the motions more fluid, more precise, more automatic. The worker's hands learn the optimal angles, the right amount of force, the perfect timing. What initially required conscious thought and careful attention becomes second nature, executed almost without thinking. This principle of learning by doing applies universally. A worker straightening wire develops techniques for achieving perfect straightness with minimal effort. A worker cutting wire learns to judge the exact length by eye and feel, moving with speed and confidence that would be impossible for someone performing the task occasionally. A worker pointing pins discovers the most efficient grinding angle and pressure. Specialization transforms competent workers into masters of their particular operation, and mastery means speed. This dexterity isn't just about moving faster, it's about moving better, wasting less effort, achieving superior results with less conscious deliberation. The human mind and body are remarkable learning machines, but they learn most effectively through repetition of specific tasks, rather than by constantly switching among different activities. Division of labor harnesses this learning capacity, allowing workers to approach the limits of human performance in their specialized domain. The second source of productivity gain is the saving of time commonly lost in passing from one species of work to another. This cause is less obvious but equally important. When a worker must perform multiple different tasks in succession, each requiring different tools, different materials, different postures, and different mental orientations, enormous amounts of time are wasted in transitions. The worker must put down one set of tools and pick up another. He must move from one workstation to another. He must shift his mental focus from one type of operation to a completely different one. These transitions interrupt the flow of work, breaking concentration and requiring physical movement that produces no value. Smith vividly described how a country workman who must change his work and his tools every half hour, applying his hand in 20 different ways almost every day of his life, acquires a habit of sauntering, of indolent and careless application. The constant switching makes sustained focused effort nearly impossible. The worker becomes constitutionally incapable of vigorous application, even on pressing occasions, because his work pattern has trained him in distraction rather than concentration. This observation reveals something profound about human psychology and work discipline. When tasks are separated and each worker performs only one operation continuously, the work itself enforces discipline and focus. There is no natural pause between operations, no excuse for sauntering or daydreaming. The flow continues uninterrupted. The worker straightening wire doesn't need to stop straightening, put his tools away, walk across the room, pick up cutting implements, adjust to a different posture and motion, and begin cutting. He simply continues straightening the next wire and the next and the next. This elimination of transition time might seem trivial, but across thousands of operations daily, the savings accumulate enormously. Modern time and motion studies have confirmed Smith's insight. A substantial portion of work time in unspecialized production is consumed not by productive activity, but by switching between activities, a form of waste that specialization eliminates almost entirely. The third, and perhaps most important source of productivity gain, is the invention of a great number of machines which facilitate and abridge labor, enabling one man to do the work of many. Smith argued that division of labor directly promotes technological innovation through multiple channels. First, when a worker's entire attention is directed to performing one simple operation, his mind naturally turns to finding easier and better methods of accomplishing that specific task. The worker becomes an expert not just in performing the operation, but in understanding its difficulties and possibilities. This focused attention makes innovation far more likely than when a worker's mental energy is scattered across many different activities. A worker who straightens wire all day will inevitably notice inefficiencies in the process and imagine improvements. A worker who spends 5 minutes straightening wire, then moves to cutting, then to pointing, then to heading, never develops the deep familiarity that breeds innovation. Smith illustrated this principle with a charming story about early steam engines, which he called fire engines. In the original design, these machines required a boy to be constantly employed opening and closing the valve between the boiler and the cylinder, timing his actions to match the ascending and descending piston. This was tedious, demanding work requiring constant attention. One boy, who loved to play with his companions and resented being chained to this boring task, observed the machine carefully and realized he could tie a string from the valve handle to another part of the machine. The motion of the machine itself would then open and shut the valve automatically, freeing him to play with his friends. This simple innovation, born from a child's desire to avoid work, represented one of the greatest improvements made to the steam engine since its invention. The story perfectly captures Smith's point. Innovation emerges from intimate familiarity with specific operations, combined with motivation to make those operations easier or less time-consuming. Smith acknowledged that not all mechanical improvements come from the workers who use the machines. Many innovations result from the ingenuity of machine makers who have made constructing such equipment their particular business. As manufacturing becomes more complex and specialized, building the machines themselves becomes a distinct trade, and these specialized manufacturers naturally focus their creativity on improving their products. Additionally, some innovations come from philosophers or men of speculation, people we might today call scientists or engineers, whose trade is not to do anything but to observe everything. These individuals can perceive connections and possibilities that might escape even expert practitioners. However, Smith insisted that the division of labor was essential even for these higher forms of innovation. By breaking complex processes into simple, clearly defined operations, specialization makes those operations easier to understand, easier to analyze, and therefore easier to mechanize or improve. A complex integrated process is opaque to analysis. A series of simple, separated operations invites both understanding and innovation. The cumulative effect of these three causes is nothing short of revolutionary. Division of labor transforms the productivity of human effort by orders of magnitude. What previously required the work of hundreds or thousands can be accomplished by dozens. What was once expensive becomes cheap. What was once scarce becomes abundant. Smith emphasized that these effects operate not just in pin making or any particular manufacture, but throughout the entire economy, in every art and trade where labor can be divided and specialized. Agriculture, he noted, admits of less division than manufacturing because many agricultural tasks cannot be completely separated. The plowman, harrower, sower, and reaper are often the same person because these tasks correspond to different seasons of the year. It's impossible for one person to be constantly employed plowing when plowing is only necessary at certain times. This limitation, Smith suggested, explains why agricultural productivity historically improved more slowly than manufacturing productivity. Where division of labor could be fully implemented, productivity soared. Where natural constraints prevented complete specialization, productivity gains remained more modest. But division of labor accomplishes something even more profound than multiplying output. It radically transforms the social organization of production and the nature of work itself. In societies without extensive division of labor, most people are generalists. They perform many different tasks, possess a wide range of skills, and produce a variety of goods for their own consumption or for local exchange. Economic activity is relatively simple, direct, and comprehensible to participants. Everyone understands the full process of making the things they use because they typically make those things themselves or watch neighbors make them. Economic life is transparent but also limited. Productivity is low, variety is restricted, and improvement is slow because no one can become truly expert at more than a few things. Division of labor creates a fundamentally different economic structure. Workers become specialists, each performing a narrow range of tasks with great skill and efficiency, but unable to complete most products independently. Production becomes a social process requiring coordination among many individuals. The making of even simple goods involves dozens or hundreds of people, though most remain invisible to each other. Smith illustrated this with the example of a woolen coat worn by a common day laborer in 18th century Britain. The shepherd who raised the sheep, the sorter who classified the wool, the comber and carder who prepared the fibers, the dyer who colored them, the spinner who created yarn, the weaver who produced cloth, the fuller who finished the fabric, the tailor who cut and sewed the garment, not to mention the makers of all the tools and machines these workers used, the builders of the ships that transported materials, the sailors who crewed those ships, the rope makers who supplied rigging, the miners who extracted the iron for tools, and countless others all contributed their specialized labor to producing that single coat. The day laborer wearing it might imagine he had purchased it from a tailor, but in reality, he was the beneficiary of a vast, intricate web of specialized production involving thousands of people across many regions and nations. This interdependence creates both opportunity and vulnerability. The opportunity is that each person can benefit from the specialized skills of thousands or millions of others. No individual must master every trade or produce everything they need. Instead, they can focus their efforts on what they do best, trading the fruits of their specialized labor for the specialized products of others. This mutual exchange, facilitated by markets and money, allows everyone to enjoy a variety and quality of goods that would be utterly impossible in a self-sufficient economy. Even a common laborer in an advanced commercial society, Smith observed, possesses accommodations far superior to those of many African kings, absolute masters of thousands of naked savages. The difference isn't that British laborers work harder than African rulers, but that British laborers benefit from the multiplied productivity of an entire specialized economy. The vulnerability, however, is that individuals become utterly dependent on the cooperation of countless others. The pin maker who specializes in straightening wire cannot eat straightened wire. He must exchange his labor for food, clothing, shelter, and everything else he needs. If markets fail, if trade is disrupted, if the complex system of exchange breaks down, the specialized worker is helpless in ways that a generalist farmer or craftsman is not. This dependence on others, on markets, on the continuation of trade is both the great strength and the potential weakness of a specialized economy. Understanding how this system of mutual dependence functions without collapsing into chaos would be one of Smith's central concerns, leading directly to his concept of the invisible hand. Division of labor also raises troubling questions about the human costs of specialization. Smith was remarkably prescient in recognizing that extreme specialization, while economically beneficial, could damage workers psychologically and intellectually. A worker who performs the same simple operation hour after hour, day after day, year after year for his entire working life may become extraordinarily productive at that operation, but his mind and character suffer. He has no occasion to exert his understanding or exercise his invention in finding solutions to difficulties, since his work presents no difficulties. He naturally loses the habit of such exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. His dexterity at his particular trade becomes purchased at the expense of his intellectual, social, and martial virtues. The very specialization that makes him economically valuable makes him humanly diminished. This critique, developed more fully in later sections of The Wealth of Nations, anticipates the concerns that later critics, including Karl Marx, would raise about alienated labor under capitalism. Smith didn't romanticize specialization or pretend it was unambiguously good for workers. He recognized real costs and explicitly argued that government had a responsibility to provide education and create institutions that would counteract the deadening effects of extreme specialization. But he also believed the productivity gains from division of labor were so immense, and the resulting improvements in living standards for even the poorest members of society so substantial that the benefits outweighed the costs. The goal should be to mitigate the human costs through education and policy, while preserving the economic benefits through markets and free exchange. The pin factory ultimately represents something larger than pins or even manufacturing. It represents the fundamental economic logic of specialization and exchange that underlies all complex societies. Smith's genius was recognizing that this logic, clearly visible in a pin factory, operated throughout the entire economy, shaping the structure of production, the nature of markets, the distribution of occupations, and the wealth of nations. Division of labor wasn't just a clever technique for making pins more efficiently. It was the primary engine of economic growth, the mechanism by which human societies had progressed from primitive subsistence to commercial prosperity. Every advance in wealth, every improvement in living standards, every expansion of productive capacity ultimately traced back to increased specialization and the more extensive division of labor that specialization enabled. But this raised the profound question that would occupy much of the rest of the wealth of nations. What makes extensive division of labor possible? Smith's answer involved three prerequisites. First, division of labor requires sufficient market size. It makes no sense to specialize in producing straight wire if there aren't enough pin factories demanding straight wire to keep you employed full time. The extent of the market limits the extent of specialization, which is why small isolated communities have little division of labor, while large cities with access to regional and international trade develop highly specialized occupations. Second, division of labor requires capital accumulation. The machines, tools, workspaces, raw materials, and inventory necessary for specialized production must be paid for before finished goods can be sold. This requires savings, investment, and the patience to await returns. Third, and most fundamentally, division of labor requires institutional arrangements that make voluntary exchange possible, profitable, and secure. People must be free to choose their occupations, free to trade with others, confident that their property will be protected, and assured that they can keep the fruits of their labor and exchange. These prerequisites would shape Smith's analysis of markets, capital, and the proper role of government, connecting the simple example of the pin factory to the largest questions of political economy, and forming the foundation for his vision of capitalist development. The most famous metaphor in all of economics appears exactly once in The Wealth of Nations. Smith writes about merchants who prefer investing domestically rather than abroad, not because they consciously intend to benefit their country, but because they naturally favor familiar markets where they can better monitor their investments and reduce risk. By preferring domestic industry, Smith observes, each merchant intends only his own security, and by directing that industry to produce goods of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. Yet in pursuing these purely selfish objectives, the merchant is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By seeking his own advantage, he frequently promotes the interest of society more effectively than when he actually intends to promote it. This passage, buried in Book 4's critique of mercantilism, contains the seed of an idea that would revolutionize economic thought. That individual self-interest, when channeled through competitive markets, can serve the common good without anyone consciously planning or intending that outcome. The invisible hand isn't really about hands. visible or otherwise. It's a metaphor for a mechanism, a systematic process by which decentralized decisions by millions of self interested individuals somehow produce order, coordination, and widespread prosperity rather than chaos. Understanding this mechanism requires examining how markets actually work, how prices function as signals, and why voluntary exchange creates wealth rather than merely redistributing it. The invisible hand represents perhaps the most counterintuitive insight in all of social science, that pursuing our own advantage within a framework of free exchange and competition typically does more good for others than consciously trying to help them through centralized planning or charitable intention. This doesn't mean selfishness is virtuous or that greed produces good outcomes. Rather, it means that institutions matter enormously, that the same self interested behavior that produces disaster in some institutional settings produces prosperity in others, and that markets represent an institutional innovation that channels self interest towards socially beneficial ends. Smith's most quoted passage on self interest appears much earlier in The Wealth of Nations, in the discussion of why division of labor emerges naturally from human propensity to trade and exchange. He writes that man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. Instead, we must interest their self-love in our favor, showing them that it is for their own advantage to do for us what we require of them. This is the meaning of every bargain and offer. Give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. This passage is often misunderstood as cynical, as reducing human motivation to pure selfishness, but that misreads Smith's point entirely. He's not claiming that benevolence doesn't exist, or that people are incapable of altruism. His theory of moral sentiments, published 17 years before The Wealth of Nations, explored human sympathy and our capacity for moral feeling in extraordinary depth. Smith knew humans possess complex motivations, including genuine concern for others. His point about the butcher, brewer, and baker is narrower and more practical. We cannot rely on benevolence alone to organize economic life, because benevolence is too scarce and too unreliable to coordinate the countless transactions necessary in a complex society. If you need meat, beer, and bread, you're far more likely to obtain them by offering something the butcher, brewer, and baker want than by appealing to their charitable impulses. This isn't cynicism, but realism about human nature and the requirements of social coordination at scale. Moreover, Smith is describing a form of mutual respect and reciprocity, not exploitation. When we address ourselves to others' self-interest, we must understand what they want and need. We must offer them something they value. Trade requires us to be other-regarding, to take the perspective of our trading partners, to provide them genuine benefit as the means of benefiting ourselves. The butcher provides meat because he wants money with which to buy things he needs. His customers provide money because they want meat. Both parties benefit from the exchange, or they wouldn't make it. This is fundamentally different from taking what we want by force or deception. Voluntary exchange in competitive markets creates a situation where helping others becomes the most effective way to help ourselves, where our prosperity depends on providing value to others. This alignment of private interest with public benefit is the essence of what the invisible hand metaphor describes. But how does this alignment actually work? How do markets coordinate the decisions of millions of separate individuals without central direction? The answer lies in the price mechanism, one of humanity's most ingenious social inventions, though nobody consciously invented it. Prices perform three critical functions that make market coordination possible. They signal information, they provide incentives, and they determine the distribution of goods and services. These three functions work together to create what economist Friedrich Hayek, building on Smith's insights 2 centuries later, called a marvel of spontaneous order. The signaling function of prices is perhaps their most important and least appreciated role. Prices convey information about relative scarcity and value in an incredibly compressed and actionable form. When the price of copper rises, it instantly communicates to everyone in the economy that copper has become more scarce relative to demand. Manufacturers who use copper receive this signal and respond by economizing on copper use, seeking substitutes, or finding more efficient production methods. Consumers of copper containing products see higher prices and reduce consumption or switch to alternatives. Meanwhile, copper producers see the higher price as a signal to increase production, to develop new mines, to extract copper from lower grade ores previously uneconomical. None of these actors need to know why copper has become scarcer. Maybe a major mine collapsed. Maybe new uses for copper were discovered. Maybe political instability disrupted supply from a major producing region. The price signal conveys all the relevant information anyone needs to respond appropriately. Copper is now more valuable relative to other goods, so use less of it or produce more of it. This informational efficiency is extraordinary. No central planner could possibly collect and process all the dispersed knowledge necessary to coordinate millions of production and consumption decisions. Information about local conditions, particular circumstances, immediate opportunities is scattered throughout society in the minds of countless individuals. A farmer knows the specific qualities of his soil, his water supply, his local climate, the particular skills of his workers. A shopkeeper knows the preferences of her customers, which products move quickly, which sit unsold, what complaints she hears. A machine operator knows the quirks of his equipment, the techniques that maximize output, the signs of impending failure. This tacit, contextual knowledge cannot be transmitted to a central authority, cannot be aggregated into statistics, cannot be captured in reports and databases. Yet markets utilize this knowledge through the price system. Each individual responds to price signals based on his particular knowledge and circumstances. The price system thus coordinates behavior without requiring anyone to possess comprehensive knowledge of the entire economy. The incentive function of prices ensures that people actually respond to the signals. It's not enough for prices to convey information about scarcity. There must be motivation to act on that information. Market prices create powerful incentives because they directly affect people's income and wealth. When copper prices rise, copper producers earn more revenue from selling their output. making increased production profitable. The higher price doesn't just inform them that copper is valuable, it rewards them for producing it. Similarly, manufacturers using copper see their costs rise if they continue using as much copper as before, making copper conservation directly profitable. Consumers face higher prices for copper products, giving them personal financial reasons to reduce consumption. Prices thus align individual incentives with social needs. When society needs more of something, prices rise, making production of that good more profitable and consumption less attractive. When society has too much of something, prices fall, making production less profitable and consumption more attractive. These incentives work without requiring anyone to understand or care about society's needs. The copper producer doesn't increase output because he's concerned about copper shortages. He does it because higher prices make expansion profitable for him personally. The manufacturer doesn't economize on copper out of social responsibility, but because copper costs have increased, threatening his profit margins. Yet the cumulative result of millions of such self-interested responses is an economy that efficiently allocates resources according to society's actual needs and values. This is the invisible hand in action. Individual pursuit of profit systematically directs resources toward their most valued uses without anyone consciously intending or planning that outcome. The rationing function of prices determines who gets scarce goods and services. When demand exceeds supply at the current price, prices rise, and only those willing and able to pay the higher price obtain the good. This might seem harsh or unfair, and indeed, price rationing does create legitimate concerns about inequality and access to necessities. But the alternative allocation mechanisms, queuing, political favoritism, random distribution, create their own problems and often worse ones. Price rationing has the advantage of directing goods to those who value them most highly, at least as measured by willingness to pay. It also creates the signals and incentives discussed above that tend to increase supply and reduce demand until balance is restored. Price ceilings that prevent rationing by price typically lead to shortages, black markets, reduced quality, and inefficient allocation of goods through waiting, connections, or seller discretion, rather than value. Smith illustrated market coordination through a famous thought experiment about making a woolen coat. The coat, worn by even a common laborer in commercial society, results from the combined labor of thousands of people. The shepherd, the wool sorter, the wool comber, the dyer, the spinner, the weaver, the fuller, the dresser, the tailor, all contribute directly. But supporting them are shipbuilders and sailors who transport wool and dyes, miners and smiths who make the tools these workers use, rope makers who supply ship's rigging, lumberers who provide masts and timbers, brick makers and carpenters who build the workshops, farmers who grow food for all these workers, and on and on. The coat represents the cooperative effort of thousands of individuals, none of whom know each other, none of whom consciously intended to cooperate in coat production, most of whom have no idea their work contributes to making coats. Yet somehow, this vast, dispersed, unconscious cooperation occurs smoothly and reliably. Markets and prices coordinate this complexity. Each worker responds to price signals, pursues his own interest, and unwittingly contributes to outcomes he never intended or imagined. Compare this market coordination to the alternatives. In a feudal manor economy, the lord might command his serfs to produce certain goods in certain quantities. This works at small scale with simple products, but becomes impossible as complexity increases. The lord cannot possibly know enough to efficiently direct the specialized labor of thousands. In modern, centrally planned economies, the Soviet Union being the primary 20th century experiment, government agencies attempted to replace market coordination with bureaucratic planning. Planners set production targets, allocated resources, determined prices. The results were catastrophic. Chronic shortages of consumer goods, massive waste of resources, technological stagnation, environmental devastation. Soviet planners could command factories to produce refrigerators, but they couldn't replicate the knowledge coordinating and incentive creating functions of market prices. Factories produced refrigerators that didn't work or that nobody wanted because planners lacked the dispersed information about consumer needs, production conditions, and technological possibilities that market prices aggregate automatically. The invisible hand turned out to be irreplaceable. Yet Smith was not a naive market fundamentalist who believed markets always produce optimal outcomes, or that government has no legitimate economic role. He recognized numerous circumstances where private interests diverge from public welfare, where markets fail to allocate resources efficiently, where government action is necessary. He advocated public funding for education specifically because extreme division of labor could stupefy workers, making them unfit for rational thought and citizenship. He supported legal protections for workers against certain abuses. He insisted that national defense and domestic security required government provision. He acknowledged that public goods like lighthouses, roads, and bridges might need government funding because private provision would be unprofitable despite social benefits. He wanted government to establish and enforce rules protecting property, enforcing contracts, preventing fraud and coercion. These institutional foundations are essential for markets to function. Without them, without the stable framework of law and order, the invisible hand doesn't work because voluntary exchange breaks down. Smith was also remarkably clear-eyed about the dangers of business power and the tendency of merchants and manufacturers to pursue policies harmful to society. He wrote that the proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from merchants should always be examined with great caution and suspicion, because it comes from an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even oppress the public, and who accordingly have, upon many occasions, both deceived and oppressed it. Merchants naturally want to narrow the competition and widen the market, to establish monopolies and restrict entry to their trades. Such arrangements benefit merchants at public expense, allowing them to charge higher prices and earn greater profits while reducing overall wealth. Smith's enthusiasm for markets was thus coupled with wariness about business interests and recognition that market competition requires active protection against those who would undermine it. The invisible hand metaphor also doesn't imply that everything people want will be provided automatically, or that markets make active planning and deliberate organization unnecessary. Businesses themselves are hierarchies where managers direct workers through command rather than market exchange. Within firms, Conscious planning and coordination replace market mechanisms. The boundary between firm and market, what activities are organized internally through management, and what activities are obtained through market purchases, is itself determined by economic calculation. Sometimes, organizing production within a single firm is more efficient. Sometimes, market exchange among independent producers is superior. The invisible hand doesn't abolish planning. It determines the scale and scope at which planning is economically efficient. Similarly, individuals must plan their lives, their careers, their businesses. They must make deliberate choices about education, location, occupation. The invisible hand doesn't make these choices for them. It provides the framework within which their plans can succeed or fail, and the signals that inform those plans. What the invisible hand does accomplish when institutional conditions are right is coordinating these millions of separate plans and decisions without requiring a master plan or central coordinator. Each person pursues his own objectives with his local knowledge and particular circumstances. Prices aggregate all this dispersed activity into signals that guide behavior. Competition prevents any individual or firm from exploiting too much power over prices. The result is an order that nobody designed, a complexity that nobody comprehends, a coordination that nobody directs. From the interaction of countless self-interested decisions emerges an economy that generally produces the goods and services people want, allocates resources toward higher value uses, adapts to changing conditions, and tends toward efficiency. This emergent order isn't perfect. Markets fail in various ways. They generate inequality. They don't automatically provide for public goods, or prevent pollution, or protect the vulnerable. But as a mechanism for coordinating economic activity and allocating resources, as an alternative to central planning or feudal command, markets channeling self-interest through voluntary exchange have proven incomparably superior. The invisible hand represents a profound insight about social order more generally. Throughout much of human history, people assumed that order required conscious design and hierarchical control. Complex, well-functioning societies must have wise rulers directing them toward good ends. Smith helped reveal that many of our most important social institutions, language, law, money, markets, emerged not from conscious design, but from countless individual actions guided by simple rules. These spontaneously evolved institutions often work better than deliberate top-down planning because they utilize dispersed knowledge and adapt organically to changing conditions. This doesn't mean all institutions should be left alone, or that conscious reform is impossible or undesirable, but it suggests humility about central planning, skepticism toward those who claim comprehensive knowledge, and appreciation for the wisdom embedded in evolved practices, even when we cannot articulate the reasons they work. The butcher, brewer, and baker thus become more than providers of meat, beer, and bread. They represent a fundamental truth about human cooperation, that we obtain the help we need from others not by commanding them or guilt-tripping them, but by making it worthwhile for them to help us. We must offer value to receive value. This requirement that we appeal to others' interests forces us to think about what others want, to understand their needs, to provide genuine benefit as the price of benefiting ourselves. Market exchange is thus a form of mutual respect, a recognition of others' autonomy, and right to refuse. Nobody can be forced to trade. Every exchange requires consent from both parties. This voluntary character of market relationships, when protected by law and embedded in competitive markets, creates the conditions under which self-interest serves social welfare. The invisible hand isn't magic or mysticism. It's the predictable result of institutional arrangements that align private advantage with public benefit, that make serving others the most reliable path to serving ourselves, that transform the universal human desire for improvement into an engine of general prosperity. The wealth of nations wasn't written in a vacuum. Smith composed his masterwork as a direct assault on the prevailing economic orthodoxy of his time, mercantilism. For over 2 centuries, European nations had organized their economic policies around a set of beliefs that Smith considered profoundly mistaken and destructive. Understanding what mercantilism was and why Smith opposed it so vigorously is essential to grasping the positive system he proposed in its place, what we now recognize as the foundational pillars of capitalism. Smith's critique of mercantilism wasn't merely theoretical. It was a sustained attack on a system that enriched politically connected merchants and manufacturers while impoverishing the general population, that created artificial monopolies and restrictions, that stifled economic development, and that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of wealth itself. Mercantilism rested on several core assumptions that seemed plausible to 18th century statesmen, but that Smith demonstrated were catastrophically wrong. The first and most fundamental error was the identification of wealth with gold and silver. Mercantilists believed that a nation's prosperity could be measured by the precious metals in its treasury. This led naturally to the conclusion that international trade was a zero-sum game. If England gained gold, some other nation must have lost it. The goal of economic policy should therefore be to accumulate as much gold and silver as possible while preventing their export. To achieve this objective, mercantilist states pursued policies designed to create favorable balances of trade, exporting more than they imported with the difference paid in precious metals. They imposed high tariffs on imports to discourage foreign purchases, granted monopolies to favored trading companies, banned the export of gold and silver, restricted colonial trade to benefit the mother country, and regulated production through guilds and quality standards. Smith rejected the mercantilist equation of wealth with precious metals, emphasizing instead that real wealth consists of a nation's productive capacity, its ability to produce goods and services that improve people's lives. Gold and silver are merely convenient mediums of exchange, ways to facilitate trade. They have value only because they can be exchanged for real goods. A nation with vast gold reserves but little productive capacity is poor in any meaningful sense, while a nation with modest gold stocks but abundant production of food, clothing, shelter, tools, and other useful goods is genuinely wealthy. This insight seems obvious now, but it represented a profound shift in thinking. Mercantilist policies that sacrificed productive capacity to accumulate precious metals were making nations poorer while making them think they were becoming richer. Smith's second major critique targeted the mercantilist belief that trade is zero-sum, arguing instead that voluntary trade benefits all parties simultaneously. When England exports wool to France and imports wine in return, both nations gain. England obtains wine at a lower cost than if it tried to produce wine domestically in an unsuitable climate. France obtains wool at a lower cost than if it attempted to maintain large sheep herds. The exchange isn't a transfer of wealth from one nation to another, but a creation of wealth for both through specialization and comparative advantage. Each nation focuses on producing goods it can make relatively efficiently and trades for goods that would be costly to produce domestically. This mutual benefit from trade extends beyond mere commodity exchange. It includes the sharing of ideas, techniques, and innovations that accompanies commercial interaction. Nations that trade actively learn from each other, adopting superior production methods, importing new technologies, and exposing their own industries to competitive pressure that drives improvement. The mercantilist focus on favorable trade balances, on exporting more than importing, rested on the confused notion that imports impoverish while exports enrich. Smith pointed out that this gets the causality backwards. The whole purpose of production is consumption. Exports are valuable only insofar as they enable imports. A nation that exported everything it produced and imported nothing would be working for foreigners' benefit while enjoying none of the fruits of its labor. The real aim of economic activity is to increase the availability of goods and services for domestic consumption, raising living standards and improving lives. Exports are a means to this end, not an end in themselves. They allow a nation to acquire things it cannot produce efficiently at home. A policy that maximizes exports while minimizing imports defeats the entire purpose of trade. Smith's most damning critique of mercantilism focused on how it served powerful special interests at public expense, noting that proposals from merchants should be examined with suspicion because merchants often advocate policies that benefit themselves while harming society. The mercantilist system worked through political influence and government favor. Merchants and manufacturers lobbied for tariffs protecting their industries from competition, for monopoly charters granting exclusive trading rights, for regulations that raised barriers to entry and prevented rivals from challenging established firms. These restrictions created artificial scarcity, allowing favored businesses to charge higher prices and earn monopoly profits. The costs fell on consumers who paid more for goods, on potential competitors who were legally excluded from markets, and on the economy as a whole, which suffered reduced efficiency and innovation. Smith observed that merchants naturally desire to narrow competition and widen their markets, to establish situations where they face few rivals but sell to many customers. This allows them to maintain high prices and generous profit margins. But what benefits an individual merchant or manufacturer through monopoly power harms society by making goods more expensive and less available. The mercantilist confusion of private interest with public welfare, the assumption that policies enriching merchants must enrich the nation, led to systematic adoption of regulations that transferred wealth from the many to the politically connected few. This wasn't capitalism in Smith's view, but a form of cronyism, where business success depended more on political connections and government favor than on efficiently serving customers. The remedy for mercantilism's failures was what Smith called the system of natural liberty. What we now recognize as free market capitalism, based on several interconnected pillars. The first and most fundamental pillar is private property rights. Individuals and firms must be able to own property, land, buildings, tools, inventory, intellectual creations without arbitrary confiscation by government or seizure by others. These property rights must be clearly defined, legally protected, and transferable. Without secure property rights, the incentive to invest, to improve property, to accumulate capital evaporates. Why build a better factory if the government might nationalize it? Why develop a valuable innovation if anyone can steal it? Why save and invest if your assets aren't protected? Property rights create the foundation for all economic activity by ensuring that people can keep the fruits of their labor and investment, that today's effort will yield tomorrow's returns. The security of property rights matters as much as their existence. Property must be protected not just from criminal theft, but from arbitrary government action, from sudden policy changes that destroy value, from regulations that amount to partial confiscation. This requires the rule of law, a legal system that treats all citizens equally, that follows predictable procedures, that constrains even government power. When property rights are insecure, when seizure or heavy taxation is a constant threat, people respond rationally by consuming rather than saving, by hiding assets rather than investing productively, by pursuing short-term gains rather than long-term improvements. Economic development requires confidence that property acquired legally today will remain yours tomorrow, that investments made this year will generate returns next year. This confidence can only exist under stable legal institutions that protect property rights reliably. The second pillar is voluntary exchange. All transactions should occur through mutual consent, with both parties agreeing to the terms without coercion. This requirement that exchange be voluntary has profound implications. It means that for a transaction to occur, both parties must expect to benefit. The seller values the money more than the good being sold. The buyer values the good more than the money paid. Both gain from exchange, or they wouldn't agree to it. Voluntary exchange thus creates wealth rather than merely transferring it. Every transaction that occurs represents a mutual improvement in the welfare of the participants. Contrast this with forced transactions, with slavery, with tribute, with taxation beyond that necessary for essential public goods, with regulations that compel people to buy or sell at dictated prices. These forced exchanges may benefit one party, but only by harming another, resulting in net destruction of value. Voluntary exchange also embodies respect for human autonomy and dignity. It treats people as ends in themselves rather than means to others' purposes. Nobody can force you to work for them, to sell to them, to buy from them. You control your own labor and property, making your own decisions about how to use them. This freedom of choice is both morally valuable in itself and economically productive. When people freely choose how to use their resources based on their knowledge and circumstances, resources tend to flow toward their highest valued uses. Central direction, even benevolent central direction, cannot match the allocative efficiency of millions of individuals making their own choices. The voluntary character of market exchange thus serves both liberty and prosperity simultaneously. The third pillar is free and open competition. Markets must be contestable, meaning that new firms can enter to challenge established ones. Competition performs several vital functions. It prevents any single firm from exercising too much market power, from raising prices arbitrarily, or reducing quality without consequence. It creates pressure for constant improvement, as firms must innovate and increase efficiency to survive against rivals. It aligns business interests with consumer welfare, since firms can profit only by attracting customers through better products, lower prices, or superior service. It disseminates information through the price system, rewarding efficient producers and punishing inefficient ones. It channels self-interest towards social benefit by making customer satisfaction the path to business success. Competition requires more than simply the absence of legal monopolies. It requires active protection against anti-competitive practices. Firms naturally try to eliminate competition through mergers, cartels, predatory pricing, exclusive dealing arrangements, and other tactics designed to monopolize markets. Smith was remarkably clear-eyed about this tendency. He noted that people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices. Business people aren't evil, but they rationally pursue their own interests, and their interest lies in reducing competition. This means that maintaining competitive markets requires vigilance, requires laws against monopolization and collusion, requires a willingness to break up firms that become too dominant. Competition doesn't maintain itself automatically. It must be actively protected. The fourth pillar is limited government intervention. Smith emphatically did not advocate for no government or for the absence of all regulation. He recognized essential government functions: national defense, administration of justice, provision of certain public goods that won't be supplied adequately by private markets. He supported public funding for education, infrastructure like roads and bridges, legal institutions that enforce contracts and protect property. What he opposed was government intervention that went beyond these essential functions to favor particular businesses or industries, to restrict competition, to regulate production and pricing, to grant monopolies, or to impede free exchange. Such interventions, he argued, almost always reduce prosperity by distorting market signals, creating artificial scarcity, protecting inefficiency, and enabling rent-seeking behavior where profit comes from political influence rather than productive activity. The case for limited intervention rests partly on government's knowledge limitations. No central authority can possess the dispersed, tacit, contextual knowledge necessary to efficiently direct economic activity. Government planners in the capital don't know the specific conditions of thousands of localities, the particular skills and preferences of millions of individuals, the constantly changing pattern of consumer demands and production possibilities. Market prices aggregate this information automatically through countless decentralized decisions. Government intervention disrupts these signals, replacing valuable information with bureaucratic diktat. The result is waste, shortages, surpluses, misallocation of resources. This doesn't mean government should never intervene, but it suggests humility about central planning and preference for market mechanisms where feasible. The case for limited intervention also rests on political economy considerations, on understanding how government power is actually used in practice. Even if government officials were perfectly benevolent and omniscient, which they aren't, Government intervention creates opportunities for rent seeking, for using political power to obtain economic advantages. Businesses lobby for tariffs, subsidies, regulations that burden competitors, legal barriers to entry. These interventions redistribute wealth from the politically weak to the politically connected without creating any new wealth. Indeed, they destroy wealth by inducing people to invest resources in lobbying rather than in productive activity, and by protecting inefficient firms from market discipline. The more government intervenes in the economy, the greater the returns to political influence, and the more resources are diverted into unproductive rent seeking. Limiting government's economic role reduces these opportunities for corruption and waste. The fifth pillar is capital accumulation and investment. Economic growth requires savings, the deferral of present consumption to build productive capacity for the future. These savings must be channeled into investment, building factories, developing new technologies, training workers, expanding businesses. Capital accumulation increases labor productivity by giving workers better tools, machines, and infrastructure. A worker with a shovel is more productive than one digging with his bare hands. A worker with an excavator is vastly more productive than one with a shovel. This multiplication of productivity through capital investment is the primary driver of rising wages and living standards. As businesses compete for workers and as capital makes workers more productive, wages rise, allowing workers to enjoy more of the increased output their enhanced productivity generates. For capital accumulation to occur, the returns to savings and investment must be protected. People must be confident that they can keep the profits from successful investments, that their capital won't be confiscated or destroyed by inflation. This again requires property rights, stable money, reasonable taxation, and the rule of law. It also requires institutions that channel savings to productive investments, financial markets that connect those with excess funds to those with profitable opportunities, banking systems, stock markets, bond markets, and other financial institutions serve this intermediary function, though they require regulation to prevent fraud and systemic risk. The presence of well-functioning capital markets is a distinguishing feature of advanced capitalist economies, enabling much larger and more efficient investment than would be possible if each business had to rely solely on its founder's personal wealth. These 5 pillars, property rights, voluntary exchange, competition, limited government, and capital accumulation, don't exist in isolation. They reinforce each other, creating a system where individual self-interest serves social welfare through the coordinating mechanism of market prices. Property rights are meaningless without the freedom to exchange property voluntarily. Competition requires the freedom to enter markets and invest capital. Capital accumulation depends on secure property rights and the expectation of returns from investment. Limited government preserves the space for private economic activity while still providing essential public goods. Together, these institutional arrangements create the conditions for prosperity. Smith's vision wasn't one of cutthroat individualism or indifference to human welfare. He recognized that markets could fail, that government had essential roles, that inequality and poverty were real problems. But he believed, based on observation and reasoning, that the mercantilist alternative of extensive government control monopoly privileges, and trade restrictions made these problems worse rather than better. The path to prosperity lay through economic freedom, through removing artificial barriers to enterprise and exchange, through allowing competition to discipline producers and empower consumers, through protecting property while limiting political interference in economic decisions. This wasn't a perfect system. No human institution is perfect. But compared to feudalism, to mercantilism, to the centrally planned economies that would be tried in the 20th century, capitalism based on these pillars demonstrated a unique capacity to generate widespread prosperity, to harness human creativity and ambition, and to coordinate the economic activities of millions of people toward mutually beneficial ends. The transformation from mercantilism to capitalism wasn't instantaneous or complete. Mercantilist policies persisted long after The Wealth of Nations was published, and battles over trade policy, monopolies, and economic regulation continue to this day. But Smith provided the intellectual framework that ultimately delegitimized mercantilism and established free market capitalism as the default understanding of how economies should be organized. His arguments convinced generations of economists, policymakers, and business leaders that wealth comes from production, not gold hoarding, that trade enriches all parties, not just the exporter, that competition benefits society, not just particular firms, that economic freedom promotes prosperity, not chaos. These insights, developed through careful observation and logical analysis, revealed mercantilism as a system serving narrow interests while impoverishing the many. They pointed toward an alternative built on property rights, voluntary exchange, competition, limited intervention, and capital accumulation. These became the pillars of capitalism, the institutional foundations for the most successful wealth-creating system humanity has ever developed. The impact of The Wealth of Nations was both immediate and enduring, though perhaps not quite in the ways Smith himself might have anticipated. The first edition sold out within 6 months of publication, an extraordinary success for a dense, demanding work of over 900 pages, filled with economic analysis, historical examples, and policy arguments. David Hume, Smith's closest friend, wrote enthusiastically praising the work, though he died just months after its publication in 1776. The book quickly attracted attention among politicians, intellectuals, and the rising commercial classes across Britain and Europe. Within a year, Prime Minister Frederick North proposed a revised tax code based on Smith's work, and by 1792, Prime Minister William Pitt praised it as the best solution to every question connected with the history of commerce or systems of political economy. Smith's arguments were being deployed in Parliament, cited in policy debates, and studied by those shaping Britain's economic future. The book's influence spread rapidly across the Atlantic to the newly independent United States, where it found an especially receptive audience. In 1807, President Thomas Jefferson wrote that Smith's Wealth of Nations was the best book to be read on economics. American political leaders, freed from British mercantile restrictions and building a new nation from scratch, found Smith's arguments for free trade, limited government interference, and economic liberty both intellectually compelling and practically useful. Alexander Hamilton, though he disagreed with some of Smith's conclusions and favored more government support for manufacturing, was deeply influenced by the wealth of nations and engaged seriously with its arguments in his own economic writings. The young American Republic became in many ways a testing ground for Smith's ideas about commercial society and economic freedom. Yet the relationship between Smith's actual arguments and how they were received and deployed is complex and often misunderstood. The wealth of nations influenced economists like Karl Marx, as well as governments and organizations, setting the terms for economic debate and discussion for the next century and a half. Smith became, in a real sense, the father of economics as an academic discipline, the founder of systematic economic analysis. But he also became a symbol, often invoked by people who had never read his work carefully, or who selectively quoted passages supporting their preferred policies, while ignoring his many qualifications, caveats, and concerns. The Wealth of Nations was transformed into something of a sacred text for advocates of laissez-faire capitalism, even though Smith himself never used that French phrase, and was far more nuanced about government's economic role than many of his supposed disciples. Smith's work provided the theoretical foundation for the rising bourgeoisie of Europe and the freshly independent United States to challenge feudal restrictions and impediments that the institutions of feudalism placed on industrial development. The mercantilist regulations, guild restrictions, trade monopolies, and aristocratic privileges that had structured European economies for centuries were increasingly seen as obstacles to prosperity rather than its foundations. Smith armed critics of these old systems with powerful arguments rooted in observation and logic, rather than mere self-interest. He demonstrated that policies benefiting particular merchants or manufacturers at public expense were not just unfair, but economically destructive. That trade restrictions impoverished rather than enriched nations. That competition served consumers better than monopoly. That economic freedom produced wealth more reliably than government direction. These arguments resonated with merchants frustrated by regulation, manufacturers seeking larger markets, workers hoping for better opportunities, and reformers wanting to dismantle aristocratic privilege. The timing of the Wealth of Nations publication proved remarkably fortuitous. Smith was writing on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, though he seems to have had little sense of the transformation about to occur. Smith was writing in an age of pre-industrial capitalism, and seems to have had no real presentiment of the gathering Industrial Revolution, with harbingers visible in great ironworks only a few miles from Edinburgh. He said almost nothing about large-scale industrial enterprise, factories employing hundreds or thousands of workers, or the revolutionary technologies that would soon remake manufacturing. His examples remained rooted in the commercial world he knew: pin factories, woolen manufacturers, agricultural production. Yet his principles, particularly about division of labor, proved extraordinarily relevant to industrial development. As factories mechanized production and broke manufacturing into ever more specialized tasks, they validated Smith's insights about how specialization multiplies productivity. The explosive economic growth of the 19th century seemed to confirm his arguments about how free markets and capital accumulation generate prosperity. Smith's influence on subsequent economic thinkers was profound and multifaceted. Classical economists, including David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and John Stuart Mill built directly on Smith's foundations, refining his theories of value and distribution, developing more sophisticated models of economic growth, and extending his analysis to new questions. Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage in international trade extended and strengthened Smith's case for free trade. Malthus's population theory engaged with Smith's optimism about economic progress, introducing darker concerns about whether growth could continue indefinitely. Mill synthesized classical economics while also introducing considerations of justice and distribution that went beyond Smith's framework. Even Karl Marx, whose critique of capitalism fundamentally challenged Smith's vision, acknowledged an immense intellectual debt to the wealth of nations. Marx adopted Smith's labor theory of value as a starting point, though he transformed it into a theory of exploitation. He built on Smith's analysis of how capitalism accumulates wealth, though he drew very different conclusions about who benefits from that accumulation and whether the system was sustainable. Marx saw clearly what Smith had recognized but perhaps not emphasized enough, that capitalism creates systematic class conflicts between workers who sell labor and capitalists who own productive property. Where Smith saw these tensions as manageable within a framework of economic growth that benefits all classes, Marx predicted they would ultimately destroy the system. Yet both thinkers agreed that understanding capitalism required analyzing its underlying dynamics of production, exchange, and accumulation, rather than merely describing its surface phenomena. In the 20th century, Smith's influence continued through economists as diverse as John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman, who disagreed profoundly with each other, but both engaged seriously with Smith's work. Keynes, who advocated substantial government intervention to manage aggregate demand and employment, nonetheless respected Smith's analysis of markets and built on his insights about investment and capital accumulation. Friedman, a champion of free markets and limited government, claimed Smith as an intellectual ancestor, while developing more sophisticated models of how markets function and fail. Friedrich Hayek, perhaps the 20th century's most important theorist of spontaneous order and market coordination, explicitly acknowledged his debt to Smith's invisible hand concept, developing it into a full theory of how decentralized knowledge gets utilized through the price system. The practical impact of Smith's ideas on economic policy has been enormous, though again more complex than simple adoption or rejection. As Smith's ideas took root, governments reduced tariffs, cut back on economic regulations, and led their nation's transition from the quest for favorable balances of trade to the search for personal profit. The 19th century saw a general movement toward freer trade, fewer restrictions on business formation, and greater economic liberty, particularly in Britain and the United States. The repeal of the Corn Laws in Britain in 1846, ending protectionist tariffs on grain imports, represented a triumph of Smith's arguments about how trade restrictions harm consumers while enriching particular producer groups. The spread of joint stock companies, the development of modern banking and finance, the expansion of international commerce, all reflected institutional developments consistent with Smith's vision of commercial society. Yet this movement toward free markets was never complete or uncontested. Governments continued to intervene extensively in economic life, to grant monopolies and subsidies, to impose tariffs and restrictions. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw growing concerns about monopoly power, labor exploitation, inequality, and financial instability that led to substantial government regulation of business, antitrust laws, labor protections, social insurance, and eventually Keynesian macroeconomic management. These interventions were often justified as necessary corrections to market failures that Smith himself might have recognized, though their critics argued they represented precisely the kind of government meddling Smith warned against. The debate over how to apply Smith's principles to modern conditions continues vigorously. Smith's legacy extends beyond economics into political philosophy and social theory. His vision of commercial society as fundamentally compatible with human flourishing, his argument that markets can coordinate social cooperation without requiring central authority, his emphasis on how institutions shape behavior and outcomes, all influence liberal political thought profoundly. The idea that individuals should be free to pursue their own conception of the good life, that voluntary association and exchange should be the basis of social order, that government power should be limited and constrained. These principles drew support from Smith's analysis, even as their specific applications remained contested. Smith helped establish the intellectual framework within which debates about markets, government, and individual liberty would be conducted for the next 2 centuries. The modern world Smith helped create looks radically different from the 18th century commercial society he described. Corporations employ millions of workers across multiple continents. Financial markets trade trillions of dollars daily. Governments routinely spend 40% or more of national income. Technology has transformed production in ways Smith could never have imagined. Global supply chains connect producers and consumers across vast distances. The scale, complexity, and interconnection of modern capitalism far exceeds anything Smith observed or analyzed. Yet the fundamental principles he identified, that division of labor multiplies productivity, that competition channels self-interest towards social benefit, that voluntary exchange creates wealth, that property rights and economic freedom matter for prosperity, that government intervention often serves special interests rather than public welfare, remain relevant to understanding how economies function and how policies affect outcomes. Critics argue, with some justice, that Smith was too optimistic about markets and insufficiently attentive to their failures and injustices. He lived before the industrial working class emerged, before massive corporations concentrated economic power, before financial crises revealed systemic instabilities in capitalist economies, before environmental degradation demonstrated that some costs go unmeasured by market prices. He couldn't have anticipated many problems modern capitalism faces, and his 18th century solutions may not address 21st century challenges. His analysis of how extreme specialization deadens workers' minds proved prescient, but his proposed remedies, mainly public education, seem inadequate to the scale of alienation modern industrial work can create. His faith that competition would prevent excessive concentration of economic power has been challenged by the rise of dominant firms in many industries. Yet dismissing Smith as irrelevant or outdated misses how much modern economies still reflect patterns he identified. when we see businesses respond to price signals, when entrepreneurs spot opportunities and allocate capital to exploit them, when consumers choose freely among competing products, when workers change jobs, seeking better wages and conditions, when regions specialize in industries matching their comparative advantages, we're witnessing the mechanisms Smith described. When we debate trade policy, considering whether tariffs protect jobs or raise prices, we're engaging with arguments Smith made. When we question whether government subsidies serve public interest or private gain, whether regulations protect consumers or entrench incumbents, whether tax policy encourages or discourages productive investment, we're asking Smith's questions even if we don't invoke his name. Smith's relevance extends to understanding capitalism's moral and social dimensions, not just its economic mechanics. He never claimed that markets alone could create a good society, or that economic efficiency was humanity's highest goal. His earlier work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, explored how societies develop ethical norms, how individuals become moral agents, how we judge right and wrong. He recognized that commercial society required particular virtues, including honesty, reliability, and self-restraint, that these weren't automatically produced by markets, but needed to be cultivated through education, culture, and institutions. He understood that extreme inequality could threaten social cohesion, that exploitation of the weak was morally wrong, even if economically profitable, that government had obligations to provide for public welfare beyond merely protecting property rights. This more complex Smith, attentive to both markets' power and their limitations, to both capitalism's productivity and its potential injustices, to both individual freedom and social obligations, provides richer insights than the caricature of Smith as a dogmatic free market ideologue. He recognized that economic systems are embedded in broader social, political, and moral contexts that shape their functioning and legitimacy. He appreciated that institutions matter enormously, that the same human behaviors that produce good outcomes under one set of rules produce terrible outcomes under another, that designing good institutions requires understanding human nature and social dynamics. These insights remain valuable for anyone grappling with how to organize economic life to promote both prosperity and justice. Adam Smith died in Edinburgh on July 17th, 1790, at age 67. He never married, living most of his adult life with his mother until her death 2 years before his own. He had ordered that most of his unpublished papers be burned, fearing perhaps that incomplete drafts and rough notes would be misunderstood or harm his reputation. We lost whatever work he had done on his planned comprehensive treatment of jurisprudence and government, though enough survived in student lecture notes to give us some sense of his broader vision. In his final years, he served as Commissioner of Customs in Scotland, enforcing the very trade restrictions he had criticized, a irony he apparently appreciated. He continued revising the theory of moral sentiments, publishing a substantially expanded 6th edition shortly before his death, though the Wealth of Nations received no further revisions after the 3rd edition in 1784. His passing was noted, but not mourned, as the loss of an epoch-making thinker. That recognition would come later, as his ideas spread and their implications became clearer. In 1790, Smith was a respected philosopher and economist, but not yet the towering figure he would become. The full transformation of economic thought and policy that his work enabled unfolded over subsequent decades, as new generations of thinkers built on his foundations, and as the industrial capitalism he had glimpsed in embryo matured into the dominant economic system of the modern world. Smith became the father of economics, not because he discovered everything important about how economies work, but because he asked the right questions, developed a systematic framework for analyzing them, and demonstrated that economic phenomena could be understood through observation and reason, rather than remaining mysterious or requiring theological explanation. The birth of modern economics and capitalism that Smith's work represents wasn't a single moment, but an extended process of intellectual development and institutional change. The wealth of nations provided the vision, the arguments, the analytical tools. But realizing that vision required practical struggles over trade policy, banking regulation, labor law, corporate governance, property rights, and countless other matters. It required technological innovation, capital accumulation, educational expansion, legal reform, political change. It required people willing to challenge established privilege, to risk capital in new ventures, to learn new skills, to move to new places, to build new institutions. Smith's contribution was showing that all this change, all this creative destruction, all this disruption of comfortable tradition could serve human welfare, could create broadly shared prosperity, could enable people to better their condition through their own efforts in cooperation with others. That remains his enduring legacy. The demonstration that economic freedom, properly understood and appropriately constrained, can generate remarkable material progress while respecting individual dignity and autonomy. The invisible hand guiding self-interested behavior towards social benefit. The multiplication of productivity through division of labor. The creation of wealth through voluntary exchange and competition. These aren't just abstract economic principles. They're descriptions of how hundreds of millions of people have escaped poverty over the past 2 centuries, how living standards have risen to levels that would have seemed miraculous to Smith's contemporaries, how humanity has achieved prosperity that earlier generations couldn't have imagined. Smith didn't cause these changes, but he helped make them intellectually possible, legitimate, and desirable. He gave us the framework for understanding capitalism and the arguments for preferring it, with all its flaws and injustices, to the alternatives humanity had tried. That achievement, whatever its limitations and whatever qualifications we might add with 2 centuries of additional experience, deserves recognition as one of the most consequential intellectual contributions in human history.